Most people have been told the same story about addiction. It's the story of dopamine, that mysterious molecule in your brain that supposedly runs out when you use drugs, watch pornography, gamble, or scroll endlessly online. And when dopamine is gone, you lose pleasure, lose motivation, and spiral into compulsion. It's a tidy story. It makes for good headlines and clickbait podcasts, but it's wrong. Addiction isn't a simple matter of dopamine depletion. It's about how your brain's control systems are wired, and more importantly, how they get hijacked. If you've ever wondered why willpower disappears at the exact moment you need it, or why some habits seem to run on autopilot no matter how determined you are, the answer isn't that you're weak. The answer is that your brain is being run by the wrong circuit. That's what this video is about. Why mainstream models of addiction miss the point, and how a biological framework, the kind we explore here at this channel, Apophenia, changes the picture completely. The popular myths. Let's start with the 3 most common lines you've probably heard. Number 1, you just need willpower. 2, you burned out your dopamine. 3, you were just chasing pleasure. All 3 sound intuitive. All 3 fall apart under real neuroscience. Addiction is not fundamentally a reward problem. It's a control system problem. It's about who gets to drive the bus, your executive cortex or your habit machinery. And in addiction, that driver quietly changes. The striatum, the hidden engine of habit. At the heart of this shift is a structure deep in your brain called the striatum. Think of the striatum as a kind of switching station. It decides what actions get launched, which cues feel important, and which patterns get repeated until they become second nature. It has 2 major hubs, the ventral striatum. The ventral striatum spotlights cues in your environment and makes them feel valuable. The dorsal striatum takes repeated actions and crystallizes them into habits. In early use, drugs or behaviors like porn or gambling activate the ventral striatum, the wanting system. But over time, control migrates to the dorsal striatum. That's when the loop becomes rigid. That's when it stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like a compulsion. Inside the striatum, there's another layer, the direct pathway which says go, and the indirect pathway which says stop. Dopamine doesn't just flood the system randomly. It biases these pathways, deciding whether a cue leads to action or inhibition. So addiction isn't about dopamine being gone, it's about dopamine working for the wrong circuit. Why willpower fails. Now, your prefrontal cortex, the brain CEO, should keep the striatum in check. The prefrontal cortex sets goals, weighs long-term outcomes, and says, yes, the cue is there, but we're not going to act on it. But in addicted states, neuroimaging consistently shows reduced prefrontal control. The cortex simply doesn't get enough traction on the brakes. Sometimes this vulnerability is present even before exposure to substances, meaning certain people are biologically more hijackable. This is why telling someone to just try harder is worse than useless. The very machinery that makes trying harder possible is offline. Beyond substances, why porn and gambling look the same. You might think this only applies to drugs like cocaine, heroin, or meth, but the same circuitry shows up in so-called behavioral addictions, pornography, gambling, even compulsive internet use. Studies of problematic internet users, for example, show structural alterations in the same reward circuits. The nucleus accumbens, the putamen, the orbitofrontal cortex. The medium may differ, pixels instead of chemicals, but the architecture of compulsion is identical. That's why it feels so eerily similar. The brain doesn't care if the trigger is a drug or a glowing screen. What matters is the cue, habit, compulsion loop. In the deeper layer, energy and routing. Now here's where apophenia introduces a different perspective. Mainstream models frame addiction as too much dopamine, but dopamine is not a dictator, it's a messenger. What matters is where the message lands and whether the system has the power to act on it. Think of the brain like a city grid. Dopamine is the car, but the real question is, which neighborhood does the car drive into, and how much electricity is flowing through that neighborhood? If dopamine arrives in a well-powered cortex, you get planning, long-term thinking, flexible choices. If the cortex is underpowered while striatal loops are running hot, dopamine reinforces compulsion. That's the biological crux. Addiction is a routing error under energy constraints. Stress accelerates this process. Cortisol pushes resources away from the cortex toward limbic and striatal systems. In survival mode, the brain defaults to short horizon decisions. That's why stress so often precedes relapse. It literally shifts blood flow and neurochemical bias toward compulsion. So the problem isn't too much dopamine. The problem is where dopamine is being routed and how much metabolic power is available for cortical control. Why popular fixes fail. This explains why mainstream fixes so often stall. Shame and morality plays don't rewire circuits. They just add stress, which makes relapse more likely. Detoxes and streaks might cut exposure to cues temporarily, but if the underlying routing error remains, relapse is inevitable. Dopamine fast, or dopamine deprivation, reduce stimulation, but do nothing to restore cortical energy or reassign salience. These are surface interventions on a deeper wiring issue. A better approach requires working at the biological level. That's what apophenia focuses on. Not moralizing, but rerouting. The reframe. Mainstream addiction advice focuses on cravings, but cravings are not the cause. They're the symptom of which system is running the show. When the striatum dominates and the prefrontal cortex dims, behavior becomes automatic. When cortical energy is restored and routing is corrected, the same person, the same you, can act as if they have an entirely different brain. That's the reframe apophenia offers. Addiction is not a failure of will, it's a misallocation of biological resources. Fix the allocation and the same dopamine now serves long-term goals instead of short-term loops. If you've ever felt like mainstream advice on addiction doesn't explain your lived experience, that's because it doesn't. The truth is deeper and more hopeful. You don't need to punish yourself into recovery. You need to understand how your circuits are wired and how to reroute them. That's what apophenia exists for. We built a free document that breaks down this framework in detail in a forum where these ideas are explored with others. If you want to go beyond the cliches and finally see how addiction biology really works, that's where to start. Because the problem isn't you, the problem is the system your brain has been forced to run on. And once you see that, the path forward becomes clear.